So this lecture is split into 3 sections, and I'll be doing the first 2, and then Steve will do the third. And what we're basically going to do is cover issues that you will likely get questions on in terms of societal inequalities, and we'll give you a little bit of depth on each issue and talk about how you would want to talk about that in a speech. And then I'll pause at random times throughout the presentation and see if anyone has questions. And if any questions pop up during the presentation, feel free to write it in the chat, and then we can address it whenever we stop. All right, so I can screen share. Oof. Okay. Can everyone see that? All right, I'm gonna take that as yes. All right, so societal inequity. So we're starting with racial inequality, and this has been a hot button issue recently, to say the least. So I think it's very, very likely that you're going to see a lot of questions about racial inequality and specifically police brutality in the United States going into this season. So this we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. All right, so first we're beginning with police brutality. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be mainly focusing on societal inequities in the United States, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about can be extrapolated to other countries, especially in the Western world. So beginning with police brutality, the causes of police brutality. So police brutality isn't a modern phenomenon in the United States. There were actually investigations into police brutality beginning in the 1920s because of racist police laws throughout the United States. Specifically in Chicago, the Illinois Crime Survey, which was conducted in 1927 and 1928, found that although African Americans made up just 5% of the area's population, they constituted 30% of victims of police killings. And so there were investigations as to why there was a disproportionate rate of police violence against Black Americans ever since the 1920s. But despite that long history of investigation, we haven't really seen solutions come through. And so deeper into the causes, there's a theory called broken windows policing, which was established by 2 social scientists in the 1980s, but you can see the echoes of that theory even before it was officially established in police laws way before then. So broken windows policing essentially is a theory that if police are able to crack down on small-time misdemeanors and non-violent crimes, they'll be able to prevent major crimes and violent crimes in the future, essentially saying that if small-time violent crimes aren't stopped, they will inevitably lead to larger crimes in the future. And so it's a kind of preventative policing. And this mentality has been implemented in police units across the country. And then in New York, it was officially adopted as a theory of policing and as a police policy in 1994, which led to other policies like stop and frisk, which was also implemented in New York. And basically what broken windows policing and these mentalities led to is over-policing and so-called preventative policing, mainly of Black and brown communities across the country. And so this is when you start to see mass incarceration with increased police visits for nonviolent calls and different scenarios like that, and minor drug crimes leading to larger charges, and also seeing police brutality in situations that don't warrant it whatsoever. For example, like traffic stops and very, very minor nonviolent drug crimes. So this over-policing took root across the country, and it began to become a big problem in the 1980s and 1990s. And it was also a huge issue in urban areas like Chicago and New York primarily. Now, this next cause is kind of a result of more recent events. You see military-grade weaponry in the hands of police officers and police departments in areas where the situation couldn't possibly warrant it. If you'll remember a couple years ago, after the killing of Mike Brown by police in Ferguson, the protests afterwards saw police responding with tanks and other military-grade weaponry, and it led to a national conversation about why police departments in relatively rural areas, like for example in the Midwest, were able to have access to this military-grade weaponry. Military-grade weaponry and over-militarization of the police was largely a result of increase in police budgets over the last 2 decades. And it led to an increased military mentality in police departments with training that made police officers think and feel like they were in a war state, which obviously isn't a good thing, and obviously police should not be feeling like. More specific examples of the kind of warrior mentality and military mentality is training sessions that police officers across the country have been encouraged to go to over the last few years. One example is warrior training by a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He has something called killology, which is basically a principle that if you aren't willing and ready to kill at any given time, you shouldn't become a police officer. And this is obviously a very, very violent and past militaristic, even warrior mentality that encourages brutality. And what this man does is basically host symposiums and conferences across the country that different police departments and police chiefs actually endorse and force their officers to go to. And so with this kind of warrior training that we've seen across the country spike since the beginning of the millennium, we've seen that there's an increased military mentality in police departments that leads to them escalating nonviolent situations to the point where you see unarmed people being killed. And finally, there's the issue of overuse of the police. This is an issue that the former chief of police in Dallas remarked on recently, that because of funding cuts to other relevant areas like social workers or homeless services or even medical services, the police have been asked to respond to a wider variety of service calls than they really should be, because recently conducted studies found that 9 out of 10 service calls for 911 that were directed to the police were actually for nonviolent encounters. And so when you have the police arriving armed and with this military mentality to a call that might have really just been a person falling asleep in a drive-through or a person falling asleep in a parking lot, you can see really, really tense and escalated situations where the police might have not been the right person to call in the first place. And so overuse of police has also been a major cause of police brutality. So now we're talking about solutions. So protest in and of itself isn't a solution, but as we've seen over the past few months, nonviolent protests in particular, like with Black Lives Matter, has led to legislative change in this country after years of other kinds of activism hasn't. So protest, although it has been issue-like, or that's a bad way to say it, although the protests recently have had issues because there have been crimes and looting associated with them, the protests have led to change in this country that we haven't seen over decades and decades of police brutality. So other more stringent possible solutions to police brutality. One is racial bias training. So this became an issue in the early 2010s when police departments across the country, in a way to combat police brutality and more specifically racial profiling, started instituting racial bias training. But the problem is, already the police academies of most departments across the country only last about 6 to 8 weeks for all of their police training. So fitting racial bias training in there became a problem. And even when it was implemented, it wasn't comprehensive enough to make a real difference in the mentality of police officers, especially when they were also being exposed to other kinds of training like killology and warrior mentality training. So while racial bias training sounds really good in theory, it's really difficult to implement on a wide scale unless there's a federal mandate to do so. And that hasn't happened. Even police departments across the country that have implemented racial bias training usually haven't made it mandatory for officers. So while it could be possibly effective, it hasn't been comprehensive enough to actually work in practice. Now, the next step is legislation. Technically, a federal mandate for racial bias training could be a kind of legislation that could have benefits as to police brutality, but there's been other legislation that's currently making its way through the House that's begun by House Democrats, I think last month. And so this new legislation bans the use of chokeholds, provides greater civil penalties for police brutality, and also bans the use of no-knock warrants. No-knock warrants are what led to the killing of Breonna Taylor, and so they've become another topic of national conversation recently. But basically what this legislation proposed by Democrats is doing is cutting down on a lot of the racist and frankly abusive practices that have become commonplace in American police departments, like chokeholds, which killed George Floyd, and no-knock warrants. So legislation like this is a good step towards demilitarizing the police and making them a more civil force. But again, it doesn't quite get to the root of the systemic racism of police brutality. And finally, defunding the police. Defunding the police has become something of a hot button topic, and they've become buzzwords. But essentially, defunding the police isn't so much just defunding the police as it is reallocating the funds of the police. So instead of police in cities getting billions and billions of dollars, some of the money that previously went to police would be reallocated to other community services, like, for example, towards social workers or mental health workers or just healthcare workers. And so this is kind of solving the problem of overuse of police and over-policing, because since 9 out of 10 calls for service aren't actually for violent calls or for violent situations, there should be other resources that people should be able to access with 911. They should be able to call someone other than the police. And so the purview of the police can become significantly narrowed to the point where they're only responding to violent calls and only responding to situations which specifically require them. And so in defunding the police, we're actually diversifying the resources that we have in our public system. And so in defunding the police and narrowing the role of the police, we could prevent the situations where police brutality would even be a possibility, because the police wouldn't be responding to non-violent situations. And so hopefully we wouldn't see police killing unarmed Black people. And so any of these solutions, if you frame them in the right way, could be answers in an extemp speech to police brutality. But it's also a good idea to go over the causes, because a lot of the solutions are bypassing the causes, like the racist mentalities and the systemic racism underlying police brutality, and just trying to stop some of the more abusive practices. All right, does anyone have any questions? Okay, moving on. All right, so now we're going to talk about, so I talked about the calls for service and social services, and another way to prevent over-policing specifically is decriminalization. This we've already been talking about. You've seen the push to legalize marijuana, and decriminalization is essentially just a step further and focusing on cutting down prison time and also decriminalizing some crimes which have no victim, essentially. So non-violent crimes, primarily petty drug crimes. And this is just a way to stop over-policing, which would then reduce police brutality. All right, so now we're moving on to talking about mass incarceration. So the causes of mass incarceration overlap pretty significantly with police brutality, again, the over-policing. So I'm not gonna talk too much about that, but this is just a chart showing how the share of the US prison population is disproportionately weighted towards Black and Hispanic individuals. All right, so this is a chart of how many people are locked up in the United States, because the United States has more people per capita in prison than in any other developed country, which is obviously a huge issue. And again, this is largely due to over-policing in the United States over the course of decades. So now, solutions. I already touched on decriminalization, so we're not going to spend too much time there. And now, mental health resources. So the rate of current serious mental illness for male inmates in the United States is 14.5%, and for female inmates, it's 31.0%. But the problem is, in the United States prison system, a lot of these inmates with mental health illnesses and mental health issues aren't getting any kind of treatment. They're really not getting the help that they need while in the prison system. And often abusive practices in the prison system, for example, putting people in solitary confinement, actually ends up exacerbating those mental health issues. And so the United States has an incredibly high rate of recidivism, which means once you go to jail, you are much, much more likely to be put back in jail for future offenses, even after you've done your service or served your time. And so mental health resources is a way to begin with recidivism prevention. So the Bureau of Justice statistics also estimated that almost 2/3 of incarcerated people in the United States suffer from substance use disorders, but only 1/4 of those people actually receive treatment while incarcerated. And so if prisons across the United States were able to start having mental health resources available to prisoners and also healthcare resources to wean people off of addiction, they could start helping prisoners solve their issues and prevent recidivism while they're still in the jail system. So you're actively solving the problem for people who are already suffering from the jail system. And then as of 2005, less than 10% of formerly incarcerated people had access to substance abuse treatment after their release. And so there's new programs in the United States, specifically in Rhode Island, that are using different kinds of healthcare resources within the prison system to begin weaning people off of addiction. They actually reported a 60.5 reduction in opioid-related mortality among recently incarcerated people in the first year after implementing their new healthcare program, which essentially used opioid as a way to wean people off of it. So it's basically addictive assisted treatment. So aside from that, there's other ways for recidivism prevention. For example, halfway houses and rehabilitation centers. So usually for people in the US prison system, the first option is state prisons, as you can see by this chart. And there usually aren't other options for people, even if the needs that they have aren't being met in state prisons. So we should invest in halfway houses and rehabilitation centers for those who need it, because some of the prisoners need more diverse treatment than they're able to get in the state prison system. And again, all of this is just a way to prevent recidivism. And medication-assisted treatment is what I was talking about earlier that was implemented in Rhode Island and saw great success. So medication-assisted treatment is another healthcare resource that prisons could implement as a way to prevent recidivism. And finally, systemic reevaluations. So essentially, appeals courts are heavily backlogged in the United States. And so it's very, very difficult for even non-violent criminal offenders to be able to have their cases revisited. So if the United States were to implement systemic reevaluations in state prisons, usually on a case-by-case basis, they could begin moving people from state prisons to halfway houses or rehabilitation centers, or even letting them out on probation, depending on what they need. And as a result, you can just reduce the overpopulation of prisons in this country and move on to rehabilitating prisoners instead of punishing them and preventing recidivism. All right, so that is mass incarceration. Any questions? Cool. All right. So now I'm going to briefly talk about the housing crisis in the United States. So many of you, if you've taken APUSH, will probably have heard about white flight in the United States, which was a phenomena in the 1950s and 1960s, where after minorities, specifically Black and brown individuals, began experiencing the economic mobility to be able to move into urban areas, white Americans fled those areas based on race-based fears and ended up moving largely to the suburbs. So here's an example of the heavy segregation that still exists in a lot of American metropolitan areas. I chose Minneapolis and St. Paul because it's not one of the urban centers that you normally think about, like New York and DC, but it does still have pretty heavy segregation, and it was the site of lots of recent protests due to the killing of George Floyd. So this is just something that I thought was interesting. So a 1968 report called the Kerner Report found that the reason for a lot of violent crimes in urban areas and just the greater rate of crime in urban areas wasn't because of Black Americans, but was because of racist policies in municipal governments, where in areas with Black Americans, primarily areas that were heavily segregated, were given fewer governmental resources than areas like suburbia, for example. And so this has been a long-ranging issue, and it's also been due to exclusionary zoning laws that have existed for a long time in this country, primarily in urban areas, that prevents from mixed income housing and sometimes affordable housing from being built in certain areas, and also prevents the diversification of neighborhoods that have existed for a long time. And so what we see is a pretty high degree of segregation existing to this day, primarily in urban areas. And one of the results of that you don't always hear about, but I have gotten a few extemp questions over the past couple years, is environmental racism. So environmental racism was actually recently confirmed by a report by the EPA National Center for Environmental Assessment. And by the way, this is the EPA under the Trump administration when it was led by Scott Pruitt. So if they're the ones saying environmental racism is a problem, then you know it is a legitimate, scary threat. So what this report essentially found was that Black people are exposed to 1.5 times more particulate matter than white people, and the Hispanic people had about 1.2 times the exposure of non-Hispanic white people. And the study found that people in poverty had about 1.3 times more exposure than people above the poverty line to particulate matter. So particulate matter results in carcinogens, and it can result in increased healthcare disparities between Black and brown and white Americans. And so largely this is due to the fact that housing around the areas that produce pollution, for example, factories and even oil rigs, are cheaper. And so because of economic inequality, and again, often racist and exclusionary zoning laws, you'll see people of color having to buy housing in proximity to these factories, and white people not going near those areas because of a lack of other options. So carcinogens, or cancer risk factors, are increased as a result of proximity to this pollution, and there's been increased instances of birth complications in Black and brown communities in proximity to factories or other polluting factors. And of course, there's the big issues of racial segregation that have resulted in this environmental racism. And obviously, one of the biggest examples of environmental racism that we've seen in recent years is Flint, Michigan, which, by the way, still doesn't have clean water, I think almost 6 years after the initial discovery of the poisoned water. So the problem is twofold here, in that Black and brown communities are more likely to be affected by these pollutants and more likely to have healthcare concerns. And they're also much less likely to get the resources that they need allocated to them, because local governments and municipal governments in this country are simply less likely to give resources to these communities, as we've seen in Flint, Michigan. So environmental racism is a question that I've seen popping up more and more at tournaments. And it's something that you really have to have the background of racist housing policy in the country to understand. And in terms of solutions, a lot of what we can do is also legislative. Obama-era regulations prevented factories in proximity to residential neighborhoods from emitting a certain amount of mercury and even a certain amount of carbon. And the Trump administration largely repealed a lot of those legislative regulations. But if those were to be re-implemented, then that can make a huge difference. And also changing housing laws as to the point where more affordable housing is built in cities would also provide more opportunities for people to leave these areas where they're essentially being forced to live by matter of economic circumstance. So yeah, that's environmental racism. Any questions? You can just type them in the chat. Okay. So moving on to healthcare inequalities. I briefly touched on this with environmental racism, but the issue goes much deeper. And it's actually a historical issue as well, because one of the primary causes of healthcare inequalities between Black and brown Americans and white Americans in this country is eugenics. So eugenics, as most of you probably know, was the completely false belief that your race made you biologically different to the point where, for example, you would feel pain differently and you had different intellectual capacities. It was obviously disproven, but the crazy thing is, so much experimentation in the early 20th century was based around eugenics that we actually still see the effects of eugenics in medical schools today. And the primary way that we see that is with misinformation. A 2016 survey of 222 white medical students and residents published in the National Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showed that at least half of them endorsed one myth about physiological differences between Black and white people, including that Black people's nerve endings are less sensitive than white people, meaning that Black people would feel less pain. Now, this is obviously false, but more than half of the medical students surveyed actually believe this. So clearly somewhere the healthcare system has failed, because the legacy of eugenics led to misinformation that is still affecting future doctors today. And one of the reasons for not only eugenics, but for the difference in care given to Black and white patients, is that Black people have been historically devalued and exploited by the healthcare system in the United States. An early example is Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman who was a medical phenomenon, essentially, because her cells are immortal. They just did not age and did not die. And so scientists were absolutely shocked when they found this when she went to the hospital for a routine checkup. And without consenting her or her family, they didn't treat her and stole her genetic information and her cells and used it in research and treatments for literally decades. We are still using Henrietta Lacks cells, which are called HeLa cells. And she and her family never saw a penny of the profit and were never given any of the credit that they were due, even after her genetic information was essentially stolen and exploited. And so there's a history of devaluation of Black people in the healthcare system in this country. And so that's led to a lot of racial biases in the care that Black and white Americans receive. And Henrietta Lacks, by the way, is a really cool AGD because she has an insane story and we're still using her cells in scientific research, and yet she's never given any kind of credit for that. So now we see that disparities exist in the kind of care that Black and white people receive in the United States. 200 Black people die every single day in the United States who would not have died if the African-American health experience was equal to that of white people. And this is according to Harvard social scientist David Williams. And we also find that Black, American Indian, and Alaska Native women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. There is a huge disparity in maternal mortality in this country. And one of the reasons for that is that doctors just simply are less likely to listen to Black and brown women when they say that there's a problem. They're less likely to be believed. They're less likely to be treated as if they're simply trying to con nurses for healthcare medication or pain meds, which they're obviously not. One famous example is Serena Williams, the tennis player. She almost died after giving birth to her daughter because she was telling nurses that she couldn't breathe, and nurses just didn't believe her, despite it literally being Serena Williams. She clearly knows what's going on with her own body. And she had a complication with her lungs that caused her to nearly die. They had to do surgery on her after she gave birth, and nurses still were not listening to her. So that's another possible AGD. So solutions. While implicit bias or racial training may not be the best solution for police officers, it is a really good solution for the healthcare system. Specifically, if implicit bias training were to be implemented in medical schools, we could combat the misinformation amongst medical students and residents early and essentially solve the problem altogether. And because medical school training is already so comprehensive and obviously also mandatory, it would be much easier and much more effective to implement implicit bias training in medical schools themselves, but it could also be reiterated, in hospital programs. So the solution to healthcare inequalities is much simpler. It's not necessarily easy because it would still be difficult to implement and it would still take years to fully process through the system, but implementing implicit bias training is a very, very good way to get started and to solve this problem. All right. Now, that was racial inequality. I know we went through a lot, so if anyone has any questions, please let me know. You can type it in the chat. Okay, cool. So now, gender inequality. So I'm going to start with the Equal Rights Amendment. And again, this might be something that you covered in APUSH, but it's also affecting history today. So the Equal Rights Amendment was a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution that was initially proposed in 1972, but is still technically, I guess, in progress would be the way to say it. So the reason for the Equal Rights Amendment is that the word woman, or women, is never actually mentioned in the US Constitution. And so the 14th Amendment was initially considered to be sufficient to cover the rights of women in the United States, but a few key Supreme Court cases revealed that the 14th Amendment doesn't actually provide equal protections for genders and sexes. And so it wasn't sufficient. So the case that really exposed this was Frontiero v. Richardson, which was actually argued by RBG in front of the Supreme Court back when she was an appellate lawyer. And Frontiero v. Richardson was a lawsuit brought up because while servicemen currently serving in the US military could claim their wives and families as dependents and obtain housing for them, service women were not able to do the same. And so a few service women sued and eventually won the case that allowed them to declare their husbands and families as dependents and obtain housing for them. But the problem was, there was no equal protection in the Constitution that guaranteed that was the case. Every time a case like that occurred, it would have to go and be independently argued before the Supreme Court. And so the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed. The initial life of the Equal Rights Amendment was from 1972 to 81. So it was passed by both the House and the Senate, and it needed to be approved by 3/4 of the states in the country, which was 38 states. But unfortunately, by the deadline in 1981, only 35 states actually ended up ratifying the amendment. But since then, after the Equal Rights Amendment technically expired, Illinois, Nevada, and Virginia in January of 2020 finally ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. So technically now it has 38 states. It should be able to be put into the Constitution. It technically has everything it has, everything it needs, but since the deadline passed, it technically has to do the entire process over again. So the House of Representatives this year actually passed the Equal Rights Amendment again. So then it went to the Senate, where Mitch McConnell is the majority leader, and he, of course, said that he has no plans to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, and it's basically dead in its tracks there, which is hugely problematic, because the Equal Rights Amendment has significant benefits for this country. Here are some examples. First, the Violence Against Women Act. The Violence Against Women Act was actually a federal act that was signed into law by Bill Clinton, so way back in the 90s, and then later became renewed in 2000, 2005, 2013, and 2018. But in 2018, when it was supposed to be renewed, it was stalled in the Senate. Again, thank you, Mitch McConnell. And right now it's up in the air. It's technically expired and it hasn't been renewed. The Violence Against Women Act prevents domestic abuse in this country actively and provides resources to battered women who need it when they're working to rebuild their lives. So it's an absolutely essential act that has gone out of effect now because of partisan fighting. And if the Equal Rights Amendment were ratified and became a part of the United States Constitution, then things like the Violence Against Women Act would essentially be enshrined under that amendment. And so they wouldn't have to be repeatedly reinstituted the way that they are now. And it would become a much, much easier process to getting them through. Now, Title IX essentially guaranteed equal rights in terms of education to women, and it also happened in 1972. But in recent years, the Trump administration has been scaling back a lot of the Title IX protections. But if the Equal Rights Amendment were enshrined, they wouldn't be able to do that. Title IX would be protected. Oh, Betsy DeVos. And also gender wage discrimination would be much, much more difficult to do. It would be much more difficult to discriminate in terms of wages if the Equal Rights Amendment were enshrined in the Constitution, and it would also be more difficult to do pregnancy discrimination and prevent women from getting reproductive rights. So generally, the Equal Rights Amendment could be the first step of solution to a lot of different gender issues that we're seeing today and that you will be getting questions about. So the Equal Rights Amendment could technically be an answer, or at least part of an answer that you could use if you're answering questions about any of these underlying issues like Title IX or gender wage discrimination or even reproductive health. All right, so we're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to skim past this slide, but this is just an overview of Title IX, which is a civil rights act that prevents sex discrimination in any way, shape, or form from any institutions that are receiving federal funding. So Title IX is an old act that has many, many applications, and it happened under the Education Amendments of 1972 for all programs receiving federal financial assistance, including sexual harassment. And Title IX includes sexual harassment because since the stipulation is that every institution receiving federal financial assistance has to treat men and women equally and provide equal funding and provide equal rights, then sexual harassment is an infringement upon the equal rights promised by Title IX. And so Title IX is technically supposed to prevent sexual harassment and sexual abuse, specifically in educational institutions in the United States, but it hasn't quite done that. So in 2011, after a slew of sexual abuse and sexual harassment cases across college campuses in this country, the Obama administration began the Dear Colleague letter. And it was essentially a statement to colleges across the country that they had to use the preponderance of the evidence standard when treating any sexual harassment cases that came up on their campus. And the preponderance of the evidence standard essentially states that there's a greater than 50% chance that a claim is true. So it's not quite innocent until proven guilty. Because there was an issue that so many women and girls were not believed and were not given the help and resources that they needed when they came forward with allegations of sexual abuse, the Obama Dear Colleague letter essentially sort of forced colleges to follow the preponderance of the evidence standard and essentially believe women. But under the Trump administration, the preponderance of the evidence standard was removed and instead replaced by the clear and convincing evidence. And also forces colleges to have a presumption of innocence. And essentially what this is happening is what is happening is that colleges aren't forced to act with as much urgency and believe women and girls as they would under the Obama era. The new Title IX regulations under Betsy DeVos have also changed the definition as to what a sexual assault is, making it more difficult to prove that what happens is actually a sexual assault. They essentially started a stricter definition. And they also have a really bizarre stipulation that allows the victim to be cross-examined in a court of law by the abuser, which is ridiculous and allows intimidation of the victim, intimidation of the witness. And it's a really, really weird thing that was repealed as a protection from the Obama era. So essentially, under the new Title IX regulations proposed by Betsy DeVos and going into effect in the country right now, a lot of the Title IX regulations that were preventing sexual harassment, or at least improving the situation, are going away. Yes, Title IX is supposed to prevent the sexual harassment and abuse of students of all genders. The only issue is that it's disproportionately female students who are facing sexual harassment. But yes, that is true. Sorry, that was a question. I think everyone can see that. Okay. All right, now moving on to broader sexual harassment in the United States. So some of the issues associated with sexual harassment are a prevalence of rape culture in the United States. Again, rape culture extends through every facet of our culture. There's a lot of really, really good books on it. If anyone is interested, they can let me know and I can recommend some books on it. But anyway, rape culture begins often in the education system, and even before that with parents essentially telling girls that they should act in a certain way so that they won't be raped, instead of telling boys that it's wrong to rape. That is the simplest version of rape culture, but it's very pervasive and it can be seen in our media, in our education, in our government, pretty much everywhere. Other issues associated with sexual harassment. There is a real threat to the mental health and physical safety of women that can affect every facet of their lives after they've been sexually harassed. It can result in economic security issues, as they will be threatened in the workplace and may be afraid to go to their work. And it leads to a leadership gap, because women who are sexually abused or harassed in the workplace are much more likely to leave their jobs or be less aggressive in their jobs, leading to less climbing up the corporate ladder, for example. And so these are some of the issues that are associated with sexual harassment, but are not causes of sexual harassment. And then there's doxing. So doxing is the exposing of private information on the internet. It became prominent a couple years ago with Gamergate. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar, but those were huge instances of sexual harassment against women who were speaking out about sexual harassment in the gaming industry. And that can also lead to loss of job and physical threats as well. So solution. One of the big solutions that we've seen in recent years is the Me Too movement. And of course, that has made a massive difference recently in the way that we treat sexual harassment cases, the way that we treat women who come forthwith allegations, and Me Too has really been paramount in shaping the public perspective on both rape culture and sexual harassment and the way that we treat these issues, which with something like sexual harassment is hugely important, and that can be a point for you when you're answering questions about sexual harassment or even rape culture. Next, information campaigns. So information campaigns can take place on educational campuses like colleges and universities, or in the workplace. And information campaigns inform women about the dangers of sexual harassment and also are informative to people who may not necessarily realize that they are being harassive and being abusive. So information campaigns are one possible solution. There's also corporate deterrence and policies. This has become hugely important recently, as people who are accused of sexual abuse or harassment, even before there's any legal or punitive action against them, end up losing their jobs or end up facing some kind of consequence in corporate America. And that is a massive deterrent to sexual harassment. And it's very, very quick acting, much faster than the legal system. But companies should be providing accessible legal pathways to women who have allegations of sexual harassment, because a lot of the time women are bullied into dropping these allegations, or they simply don't have the resources to bring up a civil suit against their abuser. And so if corporations and universities were able to provide legal pathways and help women in every step of bringing the accusations to light, it would be much, much more helpful. And I already talked about this, but again, public perception is uniquely effective in this situation because of the prevalence of social media conversation and national conversation about sexual harassment. All right, now on to the gender wage gap. So, causes of the gender wage gap. So occupational sorting refers to the idea that there are female-dominated and male-dominated jobs. These are historically female-dominated and male-dominated jobs. For example, female-dominated jobs would be teachers or nurses. And the idea of occupational sorting and the accompanying discrimination isn't that the jobs themselves are the issue, but the fact that female-dominated jobs are considered less valuable by society and on average have a lower salary than male-dominated jobs. And there's also discrimination to women that is exacerbated for women of color, leading to a pretty significant gender wage gap in the United States. And finally, childcare penalties. This is something that I would encourage you all to talk about in any extemp speech about a gender wage gap, because it's something that we don't hear about a lot. After having their first child, women are much, much more likely to see a decline in their salary or see a plateau in their salary than men. And childcare penalties often include losing your job after having a child. While it's technically illegal to discriminate against women for pregnancy, it's often really, really difficult to prove that that discrimination happened, and it's difficult for women to seek legal action against that. And so basically, women are penalized both in terms of their wage and sometimes in terms of just losing their job for having children, despite the fact that there is a huge emphasis in our society for women to have children. So solutions. First, not asking for prior salary history. This doesn't address the root cause of gender wage gaps, but by not asking for prior salary history during job interviews, you can actually sort of cut off the cycle of abuse, because your new salary is usually based on your prior salary. And if you were being discriminated against as an effect of the gender wage gap, then that will only continue through jobs if salary history is used. Next, we have transparency. So if companies were to publish their data on their gender wage gaps, and the fact that they have gender wage gaps, essentially just publishing salary information on average between male and female employees who are hired around the same time and have the same level of responsibility, public perception and public boycott, public policing essentially would take care of the job of forcing companies to change. Because as we've seen in the last few years, boycotting can have a huge impact on corporate practices in America. And finally, maternity protection. The United States is actually the only developed country in the world that doesn't promise maternity leave or paternity leave for its workers. So federally mandated maternity leave and maternity protection. For example, a guarantee that your job would be there waiting for you after you have a child would go a long way towards improving the gender wage gap in the United States. So here's what I was talking about, the child care penalty, that women's earnings and economic impact decreases significantly after the birth of their first child, where men don't. And again, this is more information as to gender wage gaps in the United States. Cool. Now, reproductive rights. The Affordable Care Act actually went a decent way to improving reproductive rights in the United States. For example, the birth control mandate required employers to offer contraceptive inclusive insurance to women in their employ. So the Affordable Care Act actually mandated that some kind of reproductive rights were given to female employees. But now we've seen other issues, not only related to calls for repealing the Affordable Care Act, even though that hasn't actually gone through. We've seen removal of abortion clinics throughout this country to the point where some states have one or no abortion clinics, including Alabama. And we've seen Planned Parenthood being targeted and stripped of funding to the point where they're barely able to function. Under the Trump administration, a new mandate as part of the Affordable Care Act found that women covered by Medicaid, often poorer women, couldn't go to Planned Parenthood, not only for abortions, but for any kind of contraceptive health or reproductive health, which is hugely problematic. And there's also been gag rules preventing Planned Parenthood from functioning as it normally should, and a recent act brought up by Republicans called the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, which states that abortions cannot happen after a certain degree of weeks, even though that officially contradicts Roe v. Wade. There's also been the more recent Conscious and Religious Freedom Act, which found that any doctors or hospitals can object to giving abortions or providing other kinds of reproductive health care as a result of their religious belief, which prevents the opportunities and options that women have for reproductive health. In 25 states, the majority of women live in a county with no abortion clinic, largely throughout the South. All right. So the causes for this issue, the lack of abortion clinics in the United States. TRAP laws, which stand for Targeted Restriction on Abortion Providers. 11 states have significant TRAP laws, primarily Republican-controlled states, that basically prevent abortion clinics from working. These can range from building codes to some healthcare codes that don't really apply, that lead to abortion clinics being shut down for no real reason. One example that I use a lot is that a healthcare clinic in Texas was forced to shut down, an abortion clinic was forced to shut down because it didn't have hallways that were wide enough for two gurneys to pass by each other, even though two gurneys passing by each other is a situation that would literally never happen in an abortion clinic. And because of that completely arbitrary TRAP law and building code, the clinic was forced to shut down. There's also been hospital veto power granted so that hospitals can prevent reproductive health or prevent their patients from going to abortion clinics, primarily including Planned Parenthood. And so because of this, you see that there are so many states when women aren't in proximity to an abortion clinic, which makes it really, really difficult for women to have abortions. Okay. Right. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If Roe v. Wade is overturned, what would that look like? Like, what would that look like for a lot of Democratic states?
All right, so if Roe v. Wade is overturned, that wouldn't necessarily make abortion illegal. So in Democratic states where state legislatures are beneficial towards reproductive rights, it wouldn't lead to a huge difference in the number of Planned Parenthoods or number of abortion clinics available because it wouldn't criminalize abortion. But in Republican states, that would pave the way for states to cut off all reproductive rights.
Yeah, so basically Roe v. Wade was making abortion a constitutional right. Mm-hmm. And so states cannot obviously make laws that go against the Constitution.
Right.
But that's no longer there if that happens.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, cool. You can stop screen sharing and then I can share my screen.
Okay.
I guess that works. All right. Okay. Can everyone see?
Yeah, you're good.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, let's take some time to talk about LGBTQ plus rights. Recently, we're seeing a lot more action from the Supreme Court supporting LGBT rights, and that's a great move, especially under the Trump administration, because repeatedly under the administration, we've seen executive orders and guidelines being scrapped that made it a lot harder for people in this community to like survive on a day-to-day basis and like not be discriminated against, because they've had to face problems historically across the United States. So let's get into that. So Lawrence v. Texas was like the first monumental court case in 2003. And it was the official decriminalization of gay marriage and overturned a lot of sodomy laws, right? So basically before this, like gay marriage was a crime across the United States. So the Supreme Court had to reverse their stance on that. And so for those of you who don't know what sodomy laws are, does anyone know what sodomy laws are?
You can't have anal sex.
Yeah, so it limits sexual acts, which oftentimes targets the LGBT plus community in general, and specifically them. So those laws were eventually deemed unconstitutional as well. And this is the court case that it overturned, which is Bowers v. Hardwick from 1986. So yeah, it took some time for this stuff to be overturned for the Supreme Court, but seeing that the Supreme Court made that progress paved the path for more of the LGBT plus community to have hope for the future. And the hope that they had was actually worthwhile. Because in 2015, I don't know if any of you guys are old enough to like remember this or like watch the news around this time, but there's a huge monumental celebration under the Obama administration in 2015 when Obergefell v. Hodges was passed, basically marriage equality, right? The precursor to this was US v. Windsor. What this basically did was eliminated the portion of the Defense of Marriage Act of 1996 that defined marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman as husband and wife, right? That's very narrow, specific language that alienates a lot of Americans across the country. So the Supreme Court deemed it would be essential to do that. And then we get into more recent terms, right? This was just 2 years ago, which was the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission ruling. If any of you remember this ruling, it was a pretty big ruling as well. What this did is essentially uphold religious freedom rights over LGBT rights. Because the baker in this scenario did not want to sell a cake to a gay or same-sex couple. And in this case, the Supreme Court sided with that bakery and the cake shop because they deemed that religious and like freedom of speech was something that the Constitution protects. And in this case, since it's a private company and a private business, they have the right to determine who they sell to. And so that set a pretty dangerous precedent moving forward, right? Because as religious rights are upheld more and more and secured more and more throughout like the Trump administration's power, we're seeing that it sets up paths of discrimination against the LGBT community, which they've continued to face historically in the country, as we've mentioned. The other thing here is that the Supreme Court, I think in the decision, highlighted how one of the key parts in the ruling was in how the Colorado Civil Rights Commission like put together its legal battle. So the ruling was also a bit confusing to the American populace, which meant that if there's a similar court case in the future, there is a chance of it being overturned or the ruling that they had previously in 2018 being contradicted by another court case ruling later on in the years. But given the conservative like majority makeup of the courts now, people are thinking that's less and less likely, although it has been pretty monumental lately because in 2020, the Supreme Court upheld anti-bias laws to cover LGBTQ plus workers. And this was incredibly surprising because Neil Gorsuch, I believe it was, who is a Supreme Court justice on the conservative side, appointed by President Trump, actually agreed with this and was on the affirmative side. And that was very, very monumental because everyone believed that he would be one of the most conservative justices, wouldn't exactly vote to protect LGBT rights. And then the Title 7, 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination because of sex, or no, allowed discrimination because of sex and language, but we ruled that it actually prohibits discrimination because of it. All right, now let's just talk about the federal government in general, right? The Supreme Court plays a huge societal role in our country, especially with the LGBT community, but the federal government did as well. So in 1953, homosexuals are banned from working in the federal government, right? The federal government sets a huge amount of precedent for the entire country. If the federal government says homosexuals can't work in our government, state governments are oftentimes more likely to reflect what the federal government is doing, just because that's now the national standard in a way. So what this did is like basically set a terrible example for the country and paved the path for more discrimination for the community. In 1993, Bill Clinton signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Does anyone know what that is?
Yes, it was a policy that people serving in the U.S. military, like that were gay, like weren't allowed to tell people about their homosexuality, weren't allowed to be prosecuted if other people didn't know that they were gay.
Exactly, right? So while this may seem like a good idea up front, that, you know, in the military, no one really wants to talk about this. It's such a contentious issue. We shouldn't like talk about it. We should just hide our internal, like whether we're in the LGBT community or not, like the biological differences there. But in reality, it creates a huge problem, because if you think about those people serving in the military and that are part of the LGBT community, they have to deal with this on a daily basis, knowing that they're the people that are being targeted by legislation such as this, that is basically there to keep them silent, right? So Don't Ask, Don't Tell was like, you shouldn't ask anyone about their sexual orientation or anything related to that, and you shouldn't tell anyone either, because it's just better if you don't. That wasn't exactly a great policy, because, you know, to end discrimination, it isn't exactly a great idea to just have people stop talking about it, right? We need to make people more aware of the issues these people face, and to end the discrimination, we should just be more open about it. So in 2012, President Obama repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And then in 2015, the military equal opportunity policy included gay and lesbian military members. And then the key here is that the Senate also confirmed Eric Fanning to be the Secretary of the Army, making him the first openly gay secretary of a U.S. military branch. So that was also a pretty monumental moment. In 2016, the transgender military ban was lifted by the Pentagon. So that was also key. However, President Trump, back at it again, as we talk about his administration, going and discriminating against these minority communities, especially the LGBT community, he reinstated the ban in 2017, and it went into effect in 2019. So the key here is that not only are these people discriminated on a day-to-day basis to the point where it affects them socially, mentally, and then like on a day-to-day basis in terms of that, emotionally, but also it also affects them physically because of the healthcare disparities that are present among their community especially. So they're at a heightened risk for cancer and chronic conditions if you're in the LGBT community. There are more mental health disparities. Transgender youth are 4 times as likely to experience depression and suicidal symptoms, and the LGBTQ youth are more than twice as likely to feel suicidal. They're more likely to be addicted to drugs across the United States. And in 2020, transgender protections have been reversed by President Trump. Again, I cannot stress enough how the Trump administration has literally done nothing about this and has only continued to make it worse. So there was guidelines put into place under the Obama administration for schools, which essentially made it so that these schools had to protect LGBT members and transgenders across their school communities. But Trump essentially got rid of those guidelines. And for example, a transgender person could be refused care at a checkup at a doctor's office. And other possible scenarios include a transgender man being denied treatment for ovarian cancer, and stuff like that, right? So across many healthcare institutions, which are institutions that are meant to help like people like heal, feel better, like get rid of these physical symptoms, these transgender individuals especially, but also the entirety of the LGBT community, struggles because of the healthcare disparities that arise. And then also protections at the state level are lacking as well. So as of July of 2018, 37 states do not expressly ban health insurance discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So that's a big problem, right? We should be sure that all humans get the access to the healthcare and make sure that there's no discrimination across it. But because these states are lacking like legal bounds for companies to make sure that there's no discrimination there, it allows for these companies to get away and slide with anything they want. And so that, again, sets a legal precedent that's terrible for the LGBT community. And then a survey from the Center for American Progress in 2017 explained that 8% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual respondents and 29% of transgender respondents reported that a healthcare provider had refused to see them because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, think about this in practical terms. This is a narrative you might want to set up through your speech, and I want to touch up on this, right? Narratives are something that are key across any speech you give, but especially in the societal inequity rounds, you want to set up this narrative showing the actual lives that these people in these communities are living, whether that be round on like environmental racism or whether it just be on LGBT rights. You want to explain to the judge very, very clearly that, look, 29%, that's almost 3 in every 10 people that are transgender in America have been refused care. What that means is that they have to go to a different hospital, go out of their way, and these people living in rural areas have to go even further. So this inconvenience could be life or death in terms of emergencies as well. And then finally, there have been non-discrimination protections relating to health insurance have been repealed, and that kind of goes towards what we just said. Which source was that? Someone asked. That source was the Center for American Progress in a survey from 2017. It was a survey. So yeah, basically, this is just a chart highlighting like the severity of these healthcare problems in the LGBT community. So 42% of transgender patients reported having experienced mistreatment by healthcare providers. 8% of all LGBTQ people and 14% of those who've experienced discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity avoided or postponed needed medical care because of discrimination from healthcare staff. So this becomes more of a life or death situation when you take that into account, right? If anyone's experiencing dangerous symptoms that they don't know are potentially dangerous, then just because they've been refused service or are scared of like asking their healthcare provider for service, then it creates problems because it could turn into a chronic problem, or it could just be life or death, and lives could be lost because of it. Then you see 23% of respondents did not see a doctor when they needed to because of fear of being mistreated as a transgender person. Again, this goes into a huge problem where our healthcare system was established to make sure that we no longer have any fears of our healthcare, and we can have a strong healthcare system across America in order to make sure that everyone is healthy in the country. But if people are scared of going to their doctor, then that creates a problem where those people are going to be unhealthy because they just aren't receiving proper care. And that's not their fault. It's more of an institutional problem again. Then 8% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual respondents and 29% of transgender respondents reported that a healthcare provider refused to see them because of their sexual orientation or gender identity in the past year. And then we just decided to include some statistics on income inequality. If you attended the United States economy lecture, this would have been a bigger topic there. But basically, the chart is showing that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And like that's like a Bernie Sanders line right there. But you know, it's actually true, and the data has supported that for years on end. And then finally, we have some resources here that you guys can use afterwards, resources on each of the things that we covered today, and links that you guys can use to file, read up on, make sure that you educate yourselves so that you can be able to put a clear and cohesive speech together for judges to understand and hopefully persuade judges to like side with you on solutions and whatnot.
Yeah, and it's always good to cite books in Extemp But especially with social inequalities, books can be really, really helpful because we talked a lot about personal narratives and being able to use those in those speeches. Those will elevate your speeches in a big way. And books are a really, really good place to get those narratives.
Do you have any recommendations for social inequalities books?
I can email you a list later on if you want more specifics for like racial or gender or LGBT. And everyone, feel free to email me.
Did you put your email in the chat?
I can do that now.
Okay, cool. The other thing is, one thing I suggest is reading books on the Supreme Court, especially for like legal issues, which are oftentimes tied together with like social issues. And like one book I know which is good is In Scalia's Shadow, which is like after Scalia left the court, just how it's going to change. So look that book up. It's pretty great about the structure of the Supreme Court and how that'll affect like society in America moving forward. With that, I think that's all we had. Oh wait, no, you want to say something?
Sorry, yeah. I was also gonna say, go ahead and start reading SCOTUS blog. It's literally just Supreme Court updates. It's pretty digestible. It's not super dense, and it's really, really helpful. And then a really cool thing you can cite for any speech related to the Supreme Court or a court case whatsoever is the briefs written by justices on the Supreme Court and dissents. RBG's dissents are famous and really, really good for a reason. So citing those is going to make your speech sound super fancy.
Yeah, SCOTUS blog is like my go-to for legal rounds. And that's applicable for like societal questions because the Supreme Court is so heavily involved. And when you cite those like dissents written by like a Supreme Court justice, like when you explain the credibility of like your sources, like that's the ultimate like big brain move to say like a Supreme Court justice and then name them, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote. So yeah, that'll make you stand out in terms of sourcing as well, not just in terms of your content and analysis, which will help, of course, if you have those sources. But yeah, if you have any other questions, we could do a short like Q&A.
Yes, pray for her.
Yeah, she's really pushing it. She's just got to make it past Trump. Then she can retire.
I like a kind of general question on this kind of stuff.
Yep.
This is like a problem I ran into like at nationals this year on like really just like all types of inequities rounds. I guess like a lot of what you talked about police brutality at the start of this lecture, but also like solutions towards LGBTQ plus inequalities. Like, how do you take these, you know, solutions that we're like learning about, reading about, and like justify them on large scales in like a way where it's believable in an extemp speech where it's like, you know, this is the solution to all our inequities problems without like either A, sounding like way too idealistic, or B, with like sounding like you're just, just like rattling off solutions.
So one thing I'd say, like personally, is like, I get like the like some of like the skepticism there is like whether or not it would work, right? You're saying like idealistically, people like want to just list off multiple solutions. I say like focus on one concrete solution. Either that, like in your thesis, say like we need to do this, and then explain like 3 reasons why and what those fix. And one thing to do there is like use a narrative and use that as like throughout your speech, like hint back at that, be like, this fixes that problem that you talk about in that one narrative in XYZ way. Or in your impact, talk about like the amount of Americans that are like directly impacted by it. So like those statistics that we showed on like the, I think second to last slide where we talked about like 29% of transgender people across America are like scared of getting healthcare or like going to a health clinic just because they're in fear that they're going to be rejected because of their like sexual orientation and whatnot. You really put it into a perspective where any of your solutions that you're providing to like fix the problems in like the healthcare system are going to help no matter what, right? And one way to also do that is like in your ASAP point, you want to highlight like it can't really get worse, right? Like, which is kind of true, right? like we're already in this terrible place. So like any solution could be a meaningful step towards like paving the way towards even more reform.
Yeah, I would also add that if you're struggling with feasibility or if you feel like you're just rattling off solutions, use case studies, usually in your A sub point, and you can give like concrete examples of whatever legislative change or whatever solution you're proposing working and explain how it worked either in the United States or maybe in a different country. And that could help ground your speech more as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Any other questions? The chat is going off on something. I don't even know.
RBG, sort of.
Oh. But yeah, any other questions on societal inequities? No? All right. Cool. In that case, Anu, thank you for dropping in. We really appreciate your time and all the information you shared with us. Hopefully you guys learned stuff. And I think your email is still in the chat, right?
Yep. It's up there.
Feel free to email her at any point.
Yep.
And she'll get back to you. All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, give her a quick round of applause on the Zoom reactions.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. That was a great lecture.
All right. We will head back to the main room now, and Anu, you can feel free to leave.
If Anu's still here, that's
No, she left, but we gave her a Zoom applause. Don't worry.
okay. That's awesome. Who's still recording, by the way?
Oh, that's me.